Welcome to Promote, Profit, Publish. I'm your host, Juliet Clark, and we have another author guest today. And this is the second book he's released in about 4 months, and it's just in time for Valentine's Day. So I'm sure if you're looking for solutions for couples, you're going to love this interview. But before we get started, I want to remind you to go over. We have one of our free trainings this Friday. You can sign up at bamagtraining.com. And this month's guest is Joey Garrity, and she's going to share superstar strategies to transform your influence into earnings. And I know for a lot of people, it's really hard. They don't know what the secret sauce is. They don't understand that this is a long-term build. And I actually heard an interview with another author on Megyn Kelly's show the other day that talked about the frustration of some people who go into this influencer industry because the people who train them lead them to believe that it's instant gratification. So they get frustrated and quite often go broke trying to be that influencer. So show up for Joey's event. It's about an hour. And once again, it's at bamagtraining.com. So today's guest for the second time is Dr. Greg Stewart, who lives in Rockwell, Texas, and is currently a full-time telehealth counselor, executive coach, and consultant. He has a BA in organizational leadership from Cornerstone University, a Master of Divinity from Grand Rapids Theological Seminary, an MA in counseling, and a PhD in counselor education and supervision. His dissertation was the relationship of emotional intelligence to job satisfaction and organizational commitment. And if you saw his first book, iCubed, that was the first one in the series. That one was information, interpretation, and intensity, and a lot about owning your triggers and working on healing. Today's is about couples. So stay tuned while Greg and I talk about his new book. Greg, welcome.
Thanks for having me. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm so excited about your second book because you guys, I'm going to tell you something about Greg that you probably don't know. He writes books faster than anybody I've ever seen. And I've seen people write books fast, but they're not good. His are actually good. So,
Thank you. Yeah.
there's so many people who go to those workshops that are like, write a book in a weekend, and they're the worst books ever. But my gosh, you got busy on a weekend and wrote a book, and it's pretty darn good.
Thank you. Yeah. I've been talking about it for so long with so many people. I just had to sit down and just do the dump. So in these two books, it was easier. Maybe a book I haven't done won't be so easy the next time, but these two were pretty easy like that.
Right. You were going to do more of a leadership type book
Yeah.
next.
That one will be just like, it'll be easy too, because I've done it so much. But yeah, the next one
Yeah.
will be easy.
You know
Yeah.
what I'm excited about that is like if you could write that for men that are like late teens, early 20s, because that seems to be, I just heard this great interview with Megyn Kelly on the collapse of parenting. And they reference that age group and that, men really need it in that age group. So back to
Yeah.
you. What inspired you to write I3 for couples, and how does it build on that previous work that you did?
I kind of stumbled upon it because, several months ago before I wrote this book, I was only on LinkedIn as far as social media. Then when I realized, got on all the social media and I started just doing, videos, reels for Instagram and stuff. And I wanted to shake it up a little bit and do some variety. So when I would do a section for iCubed, I was thinking this would be great. So why don't I do an iCube for couples, because it's the same principle, but a different way to apply it. So I actually started just doing short videos, and I would actually hold my dog just for something different, or she's just sitting there, staring. And I do a minute or so video, and then at the top I just put IQ for couples. Well, kind of like as we all do, wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, just sitting there. I'm like, man, I should write an IQ for couples, and it just took off from there. So then I didn't do anything with it. Then one weekend we went to a conference, and we actually messed up on the timing of it. So I had all day to do nothing. So I just sat down on my laptop in the hotel, and I just went to town. I wrote 80% of it like in 4 days. So I just kind of stumbled upon that. I wasn't intentional, just kind of stumbled upon like I had to write an IQ for couples. So yeah.
Yeah. And you guys, if you haven't looked at his Instagram, Instagram's like my evening thing that I do for my spare time, and he's doing a really good job with it. So, can you explain the concept of iCubed and then how it specifically applies to couples?
Right. So iCubed is, the cube comes from, it looks like I3. A lot of people pronounce it I3, but iCubed, because I was a math major in college. But it's three I's: information, interpretation, intensity. I've been using that little technique for, 25 years now because, all right, so it's almost like iCubed is like the Panama Canal. So the first lock has to fill up with water before the second lock opens. So the first lock is information. So the rule is that it is illegal for me to have any interpretation or any opinion or any intensity, any emotion until I have all the information.
Mhm.
Because what do we do as humans? As soon as we hear a piece of information, we don't challenge it, we don't check it, we don't question it. We just, do the whole bias thing and just accept it, and then immediately have an opinion and emotions. So what I've learned to do just with my own self is like, there's a lot more information. I haven't talked to the other person. I need to get more information. So I would stop myself and not have emotions and not have any or not have any opinion or not have any emotions until I got all the information. But once that fills up, say, okay, I have enough of the information, then interpretation is I just start with, negative, neutral, positive. But the challenge question there is there any other way of looking at it? Because again, our mental models just spits out an opinion, right? And we just go with it instead of saying stop, because obviously it's going to be most often negative. And we don't stop and say, oh, wait a minute, Greg, is there any other way of interpreting, what Juliet said, right? So I come up with statements, all the statements. So negative, like she meant this, she meant this. Is it true, neutral, or positive? Well, she could have meant this. So all the different types of interpretation to the information. So it's critical. That's where critical thinking is. Then finally, once that block fills up, then its intensity is basically intensity is simply how much, what's my response now? And truly how much negative or how much emotional energy do I need to respond to it? Because a lot of us have way too much emotional energy and it comes from all these assumptions. So that's
Yes.
just the technique. If we just say, I'm not going to have any opinion or any emotion until I have all the information. Just that one. Imagine if we applied that to our culture, right?
Right.
Or on social media, like X or something, right? Just, I'm not going to have an opinion until I have all the information.
Uh-huh.
So that's where it came from. So that technique I would apply to the first book, iCubed, because I just like the title, and then laid out the whole counseling process. But then same thing like with couples, husbands and wives, right? So we assume things, right, about we don't have the information about either our spouse or our children. And then especially in the interpretation, hey, is there any other way to look at it other than your spouse is a demon, right? So it's just right. So just looking at it differently. So it's a
Uh-huh.
technique that can be applied. So it's kind of like the summary of the entire book. Just use this technique, and it really it's a short fire way to use a lot of the material in the book itself. That's where it came from.
That's amazing because I think the longer you're married, the more you know how to push those buttons and get a reaction. But I mean, it sounds like you can use this with the whole family because, like when my kids were growing up, daughters are drama. They would come home, tell a story, and I'd get in that mode like, well, trust but verify because
Trust but
that's
verify.
all.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's only one side of the truth, and it sounds very dramatic. So.
Yeah. Right. And there's a couple of proverbs in chapter 18 there. One says, he who answers a matter before he hears it is a fool in their folly, which means you answer it, you give your opinion before you hear the whole thing, you're a fool. And then another one says, the first to plead his case seems right until another one comes along and examines him.
Right.
Right. So it's kind of like trust but verify kind of process, right? It's
Yeah.
wisdom principles.
Yes, yes. So in the book, you discuss the difference between, or the importance of differentiating between emotional goals and paths. How can couples practically apply this concept to improve their relationships?
Right. So as opposed to IQ and just talking more generally about emotional goals, I immediately get into the two main emotional goals for couples, namely for men and for women. The main emotional goal for men is to feel significant, respected, successful. And the main emotional goal for women is security, safety, stability. And we choose pathways, which ties into the relationship. We choose pathways in order to achieve those goals. And in our marriage, a guy will choose, honestly, we're shallow. So we'll choose, it literally comes to our wives. We feel the most significant with our wives in the relationship of intimacy and admiration and stuff. But with our wives, it has to do with, to achieve the goal of security and safety, it's through the pathways of conversation, intimate conversation, not just small talk, honesty and openness, affection, and such. So when we get triggered, the buttons are pushed. It's when, from our spouse, we feel that those two main emotional goals are being blocked. Right. So, like, you're not making me feel significant. That's why I'll complain that, you're disrespecting me. A guy will say that. A lot of times, a wife won't. She will say, I don't feel emotionally safe with you right now.
Oh,
Right.
mhm.
Right. So just the terminology we use is based in that our emotional goal is being blocked. So there's other ones like again, but it's really I say just start with I say when your emotional goals are when you're upset and you're angry, ask yourself what emotional goal is being blocked, but start with those words or and then synonyms of those words. So maybe not security, but emotionally safe, not significance, but respect. So because it's probably there's where you feel your emotional goal is being blocked, and then what pathway are you going to take? And that's honestly where affairs happen is when we're not having those goals met through our spouse, we will make the mistake and seek it elsewhere because it's always about the emotional goal that they're trying to achieve.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. You introduce RHWR, Rational, Healthy, Wise, and Right, the grid inside of your book. How can couples use this tool to evaluate their behaviors and choices?
Okay, so a lot of times, let's say, you and your spouse are arguing, and it comes down to, obviously when we get emotional, we're trying to win the argument. Rational, healthy, wise, and right, come in when we are making sure the path we choose is rational, healthy, wise, and right. Like, in order to feel significance, I'm going to work, 60 hours a week. So great, but that pathway is not healthy. Okay.
Right.
In arguing with your spouse, instead of like, well, I disagree with you and is making it personal, I say we're all as humans and couples accountable to, but we can also appeal to rational, healthy, wise, and right. So when you are having a discussion, you say, wait a minute, that is not rational. So when you say that's not rational or that's not healthy,
Uh-huh.
right? The person, instead of just disagreeing with you, no, they've got to now prove that it is rational, that the thought is rational, or that it is healthy. And when we can appeal to it, we're both accountable to it and appeal to it. So when we're arguing, a lot of times what happens is on any topic, there's a main point. My main point about buying the van, or my main point about buying the van is this. And the main points about that topic normally pass rational, healthy, wise, and right. But what happens is the second phase, which are all of the emotional statements, opinions, and that orbit around the main point. Like my mother, what about your mother? And again, you're talking about buying a van, or right, or an accusation of generalization of, what, you always get your way, right? So it's a
Right.
statement that orbits around the main point. So you go to the main point, what is rational, and they are. That's my main point and my main point. But then it becomes two goals. Like you say, like, I'm okay with that as long as, and you give your main point. So I
Uh-huh.
say skip past all of those other statements that orbit around the main point and get to the most rational, healthy, wise, and right solution moving forward.
Uh-huh.
Right. So it's being submissive to the principles of those words.
That is so funny because growing up in my household, whenever my dad said, Your mother wears combat boots, like we all knew all hell's breaking loose now.
Right. Right.
So it's that getting personal and needling. Should you say, I'm gonna just push back a little bit, I'm sure you have a word for it. Should you tell a woman that she's being irrational in the midst of all this, or is there a better word?
Well, yeah, there's a way to say it. So say for instance, I don't say you're being
Uh-huh.
irrational. I'm saying that that statement is not rational,
Ah, okay. All
right?
right.
So it's specific to what was just spoken versus again, like you said, a generalization like because what do we always do is like, you know what? Um, you're too committed to your job. Well, how do you prove or disprove that? But the generalization goes out there, and versus like, or you can't say you're being you're irrational because this is generalization. No, you got to stick to the specific statements, actions, or whatever the case is. So yeah, we no, you don't do that. You don't.
Yeah, thank you. I mean,
I'm
I could
glad
see
you asked,
saying
right? You
saying
don't. Yeah.
something like, that doesn't feel rational to me. Could you clarify that? Because I'm not connecting the dots or something like that, that makes it a little less. I don't know what
For
it is with
sure.
us women, but just don't call us irrational.
Oh, absolutely right. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
The book touches on the concept of blind areas in relationships. And what advice do you have for people that have those? Because obviously, I think every relationship, even with ourselves, sometimes we have big blind spots. So how do you approach that in a couples?
So with couples having blind spots, it's they're either not seeing their own contributions to the issue, right? And they're not holding it's a different like a double standard as far as intensity, like your offense is greater than my offense, or you're not seeing how you're actually projecting onto me. Like so from past hurt relationships, like I ask people like, if your spouse is saying they don't trust you, and it's not because of you, but it's because of past relationships. But that's a blind area because I've done nothing wrong, but you are operating as far as level of trust with me as if I did.
Right.
And a lot of it has to do with that carryover effect from past experiences onto the present topic that we don't realize. Secondly, it's just in the whole process, like of the first book, is realizing that our negative emotions, what our first blush response is to burn all the energy on the object or the person that caused the negative emotion. And we just churn all of our energy by judging the action and their character motives. Where we're blind to is we're realizing that we have to go inside and figure out what's being exposed
Mm-hmm.
because what's being exposed is that I'm feeling insecure overall about, let's say, my looks, or I'm feeling insecure overall about my success. And I am basically just needing my spouse to fill in that vacuum. And so I'm like, my intensity is very, very high towards my spouse on a small thing they did or didn't do, expectations. But what's really happening that I'm blind to is that I have a vacuum inside of me that I'm needing them to fulfill. And I talk about when it comes to identity, value, and worth, that it's a lot of times when it comes to our identity, value, and worth in couples, that's where we say we take things personally, especially from our spouses. When we take things personally, it means that I am needing you to validate me, pursue me, accept me, whatever, or adore me, because honestly, I don't adore myself. So I need you to fill it in. Now that's a deep one, but that's
Yes.
that's where it's any insult or lack of pursuit. We take it personally because that our value and worth is tied to and dependent on, contingent upon that person pursuing me because I don't feel valued and worth just in my opinion of me. And that's a lot. And a lot of even super healthy people don't realize how much it's I always say that I don't need my wife to pursue or validate me. I want her to, but I don't need her to. It just decreases that but without proactively going after that, I don't care who you are, how healthy you think you are, it is tied. It is a need, not a want. Then we respond with exaggeration and we just put the walls up and we don't even accept the want. So that's a very unhealthy way to respond, rational, healthy, wise, and right, is by putting a wall up and not even pursuing the want.
Hmm.
right? So that's a lot of the blind spots. It's really what's happening in the basement of our hearts, both in impacting our identity and worth and like bad past experiences like big T, little t trauma, those past experiences are getting dumped on this current situation. It's in that, in my book, talk about the basement. So on the surface is all the emotions, insecurity, anxiety, fear, worry, anger, depression. But in the basement are these concepts, identity and worth and trauma that are playing into our
Hmm.
current relationship, and these things aren't being set or healed, and that's what a lot of both men and women are blind to.
Absolutely. And I'm just thinking in my own situation, when things get heated, I can we take a break here? Because
Mm-hmm.
I've seen the power of how those words can destroy as well when I was growing up. So that's my I know it really irritates people in the heat of the moment to say, stop, can we just like regroup in an hour or
But
so?
honestly, that you make a good point. That is the first actual technique I give to couples, because 99% of the couples who reach out to me, what do they want to work on? Communication.
Mhm.
So that's always the thing. So what I say, so what logically happens? I say every couple has topics to discuss. That's not the issue. But when we discuss those topics, we hurt each other's feelings. And
Right.
then now we have to have an entire another conversation to recover from the hurt. I say, so literally the first step in marriage counseling is to not cause further damage. And
Mhm.
I say, literally that technique. But to your point, I say the person who does stop is doing the right thing, but what triggers the other spouse is they assume that we're never going to revisit it again. So it's just basically they feel stonewalled. So I use stop and schedule, which means let's take a break now because we don't want to escalate and cause damage, but can we revisit this in 2 hours? So if the schedule happens, then it soothes the other partner who's an active problem solver,
Mhm.
right? The person who's stopping is doing the right thing, but they need to understand that we need to promise we'll revisit it. Otherwise, it's going to feel like, so when can we talk about this? Never, right? Never revisit. But if we do stop and schedule, and the only way it works, I said, literally, you guys can never have to escalate again with this one technique. Now, of course, it's very hard to implement, but with stop and schedule, you'll never have to escalate again. And just you have permission every time. Let's step back, not
Mhm.
cause further damage, and then come back, even if it's 15 minutes. Let's take 15 minutes and grow up a little bit, right? Or half an hour or 2 hours or tomorrow at 7. That's actually an incredibly powerful thing. It's the first technique I give to couples, but it has to have the schedule piece or else it doesn't work.
Yeah, I would imagine the schedule piece, when you circle back around to it, also builds trust that this is the way we can safely communicate. I have to ask, because you said let's grow up now. I used to mediate between my ex-husband and his ex-wife all the time, and I would literally say to them, "This is like your 16-year-olds are fighting. Where are the adults here?" And I would make them like, "Go to your rooms. We'll talk about this tomorrow." Not really go to your rooms, but let's just drop in
Separate,
for
yeah.
now. But is that sort of true, that trauma? Like you both go back to that time where that trauma is interacting
Oh,
in
sure. And, and there may not be any
trust?
trauma. It's just what's happening is that in our frontal lobes is where all critical thinking is, right? But what happens when we experience those emotions, insecurity, anxiety, fear, worry, anger, depression, it's our energy gets pulled from our frontal lobe into our amygdala, which is and the emotional brain. And that's normal. But the issue is it's getting pulled from the frontal lobe. So we're not thinking clearly, we're just being emotional. And in those emotional statements, there's not logic.
Right.
So the wisest response is the emotional mind plus the logical mind combined together. And what happens is when we get upset, just there's no logic, which comes across as childish,
Right.
right? So we have to calm down and get that energy back up into the frontal lobe, honestly. That's technically what it is.
Wow. So I want to follow this up. You mentioned the importance of balancing grace and truth in relationships. How do you balance that
Right.
inside of a relationship?
So same thing like with whenever there's a disagreement, we have points at those, and I say turn those into two goals. I have a goal, you have a goal. Same thing with grace and truth. So I say grace and empathy, kindness, whatever you want to call it, grace and empathy without truth and boundaries and change or whatever is enablement. So you want to be kind and gracious, but if you don't, set boundaries and bring truth in, it's enablement. But truth and boundaries without grace and empathy is toxic. So, in every conversation, difficult conversation, you have to accomplish both goals, which simply means you have to make statements that are grace and empathy. Like, it's okay, we will figure this out. I absolutely love you. You are safe with me. And then true statement says, this will change now. Right. So
Mhm.
it's kind of a both and it's both goals have to be achieved because if it's just one or the other. And then in my first book, I talk about in our culture, it used to be like back in the 70s and 80s, or 60s, 70s, and 80s, that there was way too much truth and boundaries, like accountability. And the kids, people felt like it was toxic, like they could never succeed. Well, now the pendulum has swung way to the other side with the whole, DEI and everything else. And so now it's starting to pull back because we're seeing the ramifications where there's just grace and empathy without any truth, logic, or
Right.
boundaries.
I was going to
Oh my
say,
gosh.
can you write this for politicians?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So it's just swung the other way, but now it's stopping because all these companies are giving up the DE because it's so far. There's just no truth or boundaries or logic to it.
Right?
Right. So now it's starting to swing back because grace and empathy without truth and boundaries is so it's like we have to accomplish both goals at all times. That's what that means.
Yeah. And I think in the companies, I don't think you can have profit without truth and accountability
Of course.
inside of a company, or it's just bad. So, Greg, I cubed for couples will be out on February 4th, just in time for Valentine's Day. You guys can go buy his book, I Cubed. It is his first book, is more a dive into your own self. So where can we find you if we want to reach out and find more, or even have you come out and speak to our audience, our company? Where could we
Right.
find you?
So on Amazon, I always put out like on social media, just search for i3 book, and that'll get you to my book because there's i3 for a computer chip. So don't search for that, right? So i3 book, that's all you gotta do for search. But go to my website, becomingmore.com. Really simple, becomingmore.com. I have a contact page on there and reach out to me and let's connect. But of course, I'm all over social media too.
Yes, you are. Especially go check him out on Instagram. Greg, thank you.
Thank you, Juliet. Great being here. Bless you. Thanks for having me.